When the sheriff tugged one blanket apart, an eyeball rolled onto the floor. In 1871, in the small town of Ashford, Kansas, a seamstress named Evelyn Parker did more than just stitch quilts. She wove the very souls of the dead into her creations, trapping them in the fabric. Her quilts were known to be beautiful, but they hid something far darker, a horrifying truth no one could escape. One night, when the sheriff tugged at a blanket she had made, an eyeball rolled onto the floor, revealing the unimaginable horror that lay beneath. This is the chilling story of the seamstress who stitched people into quilts. Evelyn Parker had always been the quiet type. In the small town of Ashford, Kansas, her name was spoken with reverence. Esh was a gifted seamstress, known for creating the most intricate and beautiful quilts anyone had ever seen. Her shop was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, with rows of colorful fabrics and the soft hum of a needle working its magic. But behind the calm, there was always something strange about Evelyn, something no one could quite put their finger on. She had a presence that made people uneasy, but no one could explain why. Her shop was always quiet, almost too quiet. The gentle click of her sewing machine was the only sound in the room, yet there was an eerie stillness in the air. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones about how Evelyn seemed to stare at her quilts for hours as though she were looking beyond the fabric itself. And there were those who swore they could feel eyes watching them whenever they passed by her shop. But no one dared to question her, because Evelyn's quilts were unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Her pieces were more than just beautiful, they were magical, in a way. The stitching was so fine it almost seemed to glow in the light. Each quilt had its own pattern, intricate and unique, like it told a story. The townspeople would come from miles around to purchase one, each eager to own a piece of Evelyn's craft, but no one knew the true price they were paying. Over the years, Ashford had lost a handful of its residents. People disappeared, sometimes without a trace, and the town would whisper about the strange disappearances. There were whispers, that some of the missing had been last seen near Evelyn's shop. At first, it was easy to dismiss as coincidence. But as time passed, the disappearances grew more frequent, and the whispers grew louder. Some said Evelyn's quilts had a way of preserving people, that they kept them close long after they were gone. But what did that really mean? One evening, Sheriff Adam Wells, a practical man who didn't believe in nonsense, received a visit from a distressed widow. Her husband, who had disappeared without a trace weeks earlier, had been one of Evelyn's customers. She had gone to the shop to inquire about a quilt shed ordered for her late husband, only to be turned away by Evelyn, who acted strangely distant and cold. Sheriff, the widow, begged, "I need you to find him. I know he's still here somewhere. I can feel it. I know my husband." Sheriff Wells had heard rumors about Evelyn, of course, but he wasn't the kind of man to believe in ghost stories or town gossip. He had an obligation to the people of Ashford, to keep the peace and solve the mysteries that plagued the town. So he agreed to take a look into the situation, though he dismissed the woman's fears as nothing more than grief. The next day, Wells visited Evelyn's shop, his boots clacking on the wooden floor as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of fresh fabric and something more metallic, like iron. Evelyn sat at her sewing machine, her hands moving rhythmically, though she didn't seem to be making much progress. Her eyes never lifted from the quilt she was working on. "Evelyn," the sheriff said, his voice steady but firm, "I've got a few questions for you. There's been some talk about the missing people in this town, and your name's been mentioned more than once." Evelyn's hand froze mid-stitch. For a long moment she said nothing, the only sound the quiet hum of the sewing machine. Then, slowly, she looked up, her face serene but unsettlingly distant. "People come and go, Sheriff," she said softly, as though the words were far from her lips. "The world is full of disappearances. But sometimes, Sheriff, it's not about finding them. Sometimes, it's about keeping them close." Wells furrowed his brow, unsure of what she meant. But Evelyn's demeanor left, him feeling uneasy, as if there was something she wasn't saying, something just beneath the surface. He stepped closer, glancing at the quilt she was working on. His stomach lurched. The quilt was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't just a work of art, it was almost alive. The fabric was thick and rich, but there were odd patches sewn into the pattern pieces of what appeared to be personal items: a button, a lock of hair, a faded photograph. It was as though the quilt was holding memories, trapping them inside. As the sheriff reached out to touch it, his hand brushed against something cold, a button, small and familiar. His heart skipped a beat. It was the same button that had belonged to the missing man's jacket. Evelyn watched him, her face expressionless. "Some people leave pieces of themselves behind," she said, her voice low. "They don't mean to, but they do. and I helped them keep those pieces safe." Sheriff Wells pulled his hand back, his mind racing. What was she saying? Could this quilt have something to do with the disappearances? Was it possible that the missing people had been preserved in the fabric of her creations? Evelyn stood and walked slowly to the back of the shop, her footsteps almost silent on the wooden floor. She returned with another quilt, this one larger and heavier, as though it were filled with something much more than just fabric. She unfolded it, revealing a patchwork of strange symbols and intricate designs. The quilt was beautiful, yes, but it was also unsettling. There was a darkness woven into it that couldn't be ignored. Sheriff Wells reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the quilt. The moment his skin made contact with the fabric, a chill ran up his spine. And then, the unmistakable sensation of something moving within the quilt, something alive. But before he could pull his hand away, a soft, disembodied voice whispered from the fabric, a sound so faint it could have been his imagination. But it wasn't. It was real. "Help me." But just as the sheriff tried to make sense of what he had heard, something even more chilling would unfold the quilt, and everything it contained was about to change everything. Sheriff Adam Wells couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him as he left Evelyn's shop. The quilt, the whisper, the strange sense of something alive in her creations, they haunted him. His instincts told him something was horribly wrong, but he wasn't sure how far to push it. Was he seeing ghosts where there were none? Or was Evelyn, the quiet seamstress, somehow tied to the disappearances that had plagued Ashford? The next day, he went to the widow's house, the woman who had begged him to look into her missing husband's case. Her desperation still echoed in his ears, and he couldn't ignore the way Shed looked at him with those pleading eyes. As he stepped into the small, tidy home, the widow, Sarah, met him at the door. Her face was drawn, as though she hadn't slept in days. "Sheriff, please," she begged. "You have to find M. I know he's still out there. I know he's not gone. He wouldn't just leave me." Adam placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Carter, but we need to get the facts right. Did your husband mention anything about going to Evelyn's shop?" The widow hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the floor. "Had gone to order a quilt from her, a gift for our anniversary. Had been talking about it for weeks. He said she was the best seamstress in town, but he never came back." She paused, eyes welling up. I'm afraid she did something to him." Sheriff Wells couldn't ignore the weight of her words. Head always prided himself on being a man of reason, of logic. But the pieces of this puzzle weren't fitting together. How could Evelyn, a respected woman in the town, be involved in something as sinister as this? He left the widow's home with a new sense of urgency. The more he thought about it, the more the facts didn't make sense. The missing men and women had one thing in common: they had all been in contact with Evelyn Parker. Her name kept surfacing like a shadow, trailing the disappearance of each person. Later that afternoon, the sheriff gathered the townspeople to discuss the disappearances. Ashford was a small place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The sense of community was strong, but the unease was even stronger now. People had begun to whisper openly about Evelyn, about the oddities in her shop. Some spoke of hearing strange sounds coming from the windows at night, the faintest hum of sewing machines when no one was supposed to be there. Others swore they had seen figures in the windows, faint, blurry shapes that resembled the missing townsfolk. But the sheriff wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. Still, there was something that made his blood run cold every time he thought about the quilts. Adam spent the next few days digging deeper into Evelyn's past, visiting her shop under the guise of needing a new quilt for his own home. He watched her work in silence, her fingers moving swiftly, though her eyes remained fixed on the fabric. The more he watched her, the more he noticed something unsettling. Evelyn never seemed to look at the fabric like someone creating something beautiful. No, it was as though she were watching the fabric for something else, something beneath the surface. One night, unable to ignore his growing suspicions any longer, Sheriff Wells snuck back into Evelyn's shop. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and he slipped inside, careful not to disturb the stillness. It was late, and the only light came from the dim glow of a candle at the far corner. Evelyn was seated at her sewing machine, stitching together a new quilt, her eyes vacant. But this time, something was different. On the table beside her, a new quilt was spread out larger, heavier than the others. Sheriff Wells couldn't resist the urge to get closer. As he examined the quilt, a cold chill ran down his spine. It was unmistakable there. Sewn into the fabric were personal items. Small pieces of jewelry, buttons, even a lock of hair. His heart pounded as he recognized some of the items from the missing persons cases. This wasn't just fabric and thread. It was something else, something far darker. Just as his fingers brushed against the quilt, Evelyn's voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here, Sheriff." Her tone was flat, as if she were stating a simple fact. Adam froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly, his hand still hovering over the quilt. "You know what I've done," she said softly, her eyes never leaving the quilt. "I've kept them with me, safe. The world doesn't understand, but they're mine now." The sheriff's stomach churned. "What do you mean by safe?" he demanded, stepping forward. "Where are the missing people, Evelyn?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the quilt she was working on, her face expressionless. "Some people don't belong in this world. They're too broken, too lost to ever truly live. So I give them a place to stay, a home." The words hung in the air like poison. Adam's mind raced. It was as if the world had stopped making sense. Was she saying that these people were still alive, trapped inside the quilts? He reached for the quilt again, his mind refusing to believe what he was seeing, what she was implying. But this time he felt Ida's slight tug on the fabric, as if something were pulling back, and then he heard it, a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Help me, please." Adam recoiled in shock, his heart slamming against his ribs. The room seemed to close in on him as he backed away from the quilt, his thoughts a blur. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "Do you see, Sheriff?" Her voice was softer now, almost pitying. "They're not gone. They're here, with me in a way, and they'll stay as long as I want them to." The sheriff's mind raced. There was no logical explanation for what he had just witnessed. But one thing was clear. Evelyn wasn't just a seamstress. She was a gravekeeper, a keeper of souls, trapped in quilts, unable to escape. But as the sheriff tried to process the horrifying truth, he was unaware that the true nightmare was only just beginning. Evelyn wasn't done stitching, not by a long shot. Sheriff Adam Wells couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, a quilt, the face that had appeared, trapped behind the fabric, begging for help. Head never believed in the supernatural, never once imagined that something as ordinary as a quilt could hold the souls of the missing. But now, after what Head witnessed in Evelyn's shop, there was no denying the terrible truth. The idea gnawed at him like an open wound. The people who had disappeared from Ashford weren't dead. They were still hair-trapped in the very fabric of the quilts, their consciousnesses bound to the threads, their voices muffled but not gone. How long had they been watching? How many more would join them before Evelyn finished her? The sheriff spent the next few days gathering more evidence. He interviewed townspeople who had known the missing individuals. The stories were all too similar. Each person had been seen entering Evelyn's shop, and each had vanished soon after. No one had seen them leave. No one had heard from them again. But the most chilling part? Many of these missing people had been close to their families, their neighbors. It wasn't just that they disappeared. It was the fact that they left behind their lives like they had never existed in the first place. Adam's investigation led him back to the one place he dreaded most, Evelyn's shop. He had to know more. He had to understand how she was doing this, how she was trapping their souls in quilts. But this time, he wouldn't be going in alone. He brought along Rebecca Hayes, a historian who had been studying the strange happenings in Ashford for years. She was the only person in town who seemed to know anything about the ancient rituals that might be involved in Evelyn's twisted craft. "Sheriff, we need to understand this before it's too late," Rebecca said as they approached Evelyn's shop. Her eyes were wide with fear, but determination set her jaw. "This isn't just about Evelyn. These quilts are part of something older, something far more dangerous. We can't stop her unless we know what she's really doing." Adam nodded, his gut churning. Had seen enough to know that Evelyn wasn't just making quilts, she was performing a ritual, one that seemed to be bound by a twisted law of nature. But what was it? What did she want with the souls trapped inside the fabric? When they arrived at the shop, the door creaked open, as if waiting for them. Inside, the smell of fresh fabric mixed with something more metallic, a faint coppery scent that made Adam's skin crawl. Evelyn was there, working at her machine, her back to them. She didn't seem surprised by their arrival, though her fingers trembled as they moved over the quilt. "I knew you'd come," Evelyn said, her voice calm and empty. "It's only a matter of time before you find the truth." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice steady but tinged with fear. "We're not here to stop you, Evelyn. We're here to understand, to stop this from happening to anyone else." Evelyn didn't look up. "You think you can understand what I've done, what I've had to do?" She let out a soft laugh, though it wasn't a laugh at all. It was hollow, almost like a sigh. "I didn't choose this. It was the only way to keep them close. the only way to preserve their memories. Adam's mind raced. What do you mean? Who are you trying to preserve? Her fingers paused, and she finally looked up at them, her eyes wide with something that could have been sorrow or something much darker. The people I loved, my family, my husband, heads in one of my quilts. Rebecca stepped back, her hand pressed to her mouth. No, that's impossible. That's not how it works, isn't it? Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. You don't understand. The ones I stitch into the quilts there, not just preserved, they're trapped. And the worst part is, they don't know it. They think they're still alive, still in control. But they're not. Adam took a step forward, feeling a cold chill settle over him. What happens to them once they're in the quilt, Evelyn? What do you do to them? Evelyn's face softened as she spoke, almost as though she were speaking to someone she loved. They live on in the fabric. They witness the world, their family, their friends, but they can't interact. They can't move. All they can do is watch. They're silent witnesses to the world they left behind. Adam's blood ran cold. The people who had disappeared weren't gone. They were just frozen in time, caught in an eternal nightmare. It was worse than he had ever imagined. But there's something else, Evelyn continued, her voice growing quieter. When you trap someone's soul in a quilt, they begin to lose themselves. The longer they stay, the more they fade. Some of them go mad. Some of them start to change. She hesitated, as though afraid of what she might say next. Rebecca pressed, her voice filled with urgency. What do you mean? What happens to them? Evelyn's eyes flicked to the quilt she was working on. They become part of the fabric. Their essence, their soul, it becomes woven into the threads. They no longer think for themselves. They become the quilt, and the quilt becomes them. They are not just witnesses anymore. They're trapped in a place where they can't move, can't speak, can't scream. Adam felt a shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just a curse, it was a prison, a never-ending cycle of torment. But something in Evelyn's words didn't add up. She was hiding something. He could feel it. What aren't you telling us? He demanded. You said some of them change. What does that mean? Evelyn paused, her fingers still, the needle suspended in midair. Her face twisted with a look of horror. Some of them fight. They claw at the fabric, trying to break free. They become violent, desperate. And when that happens, they take what they need, what they want. Rebecca's eyes widened. You mean they're not just trapped, they're feeding off each other? Evelyn nodded, her face pale. Yes, the longer they stay, the more powerful they become. And when they reach that point, nothing can stop them. But as the sheriff realized the true horror of what Evelyn had done, something even darker loomed on the horizon, something that would make everything he had feared seem like nothing more than a whisper in the wind. The air in Evelyn's shop was thick with tension as Sheriff Adam Wells processed what he had just heard. The souls of the missing weren't just trapped, they were feeding off each other, growing stronger with every passing day. The reality of what he was up against was far worse than anything he could have imagined. These weren't just missing people. They were in limbo, trapped in a state between life and death, where they could only watch the world go by. And some of them were changing. The quilt Evelyn was working on, its threads seemed to hum with a life of their own. Every fiber, every stitch carried something far darker than mere craftsmanship. The more Adam studied it, the more it seemed to pulse beneath his fingertips, as if something inside was waiting to break free. He knew he had to act fast before things got worse, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. Evelyn seemed to sense the shift in the air. Her expression grew distant, as if she were lost in thought, her eyes focusing on nothing. Then, without a word, she stood up from her sewing machine and walked toward the back of the shop, disappearing into the shadows. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the silence as Adam exchanged a brief, apprehensive glance with Rebecca. Stay alert, Adam whispered, though he was certain Rebecca had already picked up on the palpable sense of dread. Together they moved quietly to the back of the shop, stepping past bolts of fabric and half-finished quilts as though the very walls were closing in around them. As they neared the back room, Adam's heart raced. The atmosphere had changed. The air felt colder, heavier. A faint, unmistakable sound reached their ears, a soft, muted scratching. It was coming from behind a closed door. Adam reached for the doorknob, but just as his hand touched the brass, the door swung open with a sudden force, as if it had been waiting for them. The light from the main shop flooded the room, illuminating a single large quilt spread out across a table in the center of the room. This one was different from the others. It was large, almost impossibly so, and its edges seemed to ripple unnaturally. And that was when Adam saw it. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, But as his eyes adjusted, the horror unfolded in front of him. The quilt wasn't just a pattern of fabric and thread, it was alive. The seam shifted, moving like the breath of a living creature. The quilt wasn't just a place for souls to be trapped. It had become something else, a figure distorted, almost inhuman, begging to emerge from within the quilt. It wasn't fully formed, but its shape was unmistakable. A face, twisted and contorted in agony, slowly pressed against the fabric from the inside. It had the same hollow eyes Adam had seen in the quilt earlier, but this time, it was more than just a faint whisper. The face was alive, aware. Adam stepped back, his breath caught in his throat, but Rebecca was already moving, her face pale with fear. "What is that? What the hell is that, Evelyn?" Evelyn's voice drifted into the room from the doorway. She appeared, standing in the shadows, a look of quiet resignation on her face. "That's the first one," she said softly, as if discussing the weather. "The first soul to truly change." The creature inside the quilt began to claw at the fabric, its fingers pressing through the cloth as if trying to escape, trying to break free. It snarled, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream, but the sound that came from it was something far worse, an unsettling, bone-chilling hiss that echoed in Adam's bones. This isn't just a trap," Adam said, his voice shaking. "It's a transformation. You've turned them into something else." Evelyn nodded, her eyes distant. "At first, it was just about preserving them, keeping them with me. But as the years passed, I realized they were changing. They were becoming something more. The longer they stay, the more they learn, the more they hunger for more." She looked at Adam, her expression unreadable. "They want to be free, Sheriff. They want to break through." The creature inside the quilt gave another agonized screech, its hands pushing harder against the fabric. The quilt itself seemed to pulse with life, as though it were breathing. Adam's stomach turned. The whole room felt like it was alive, as if the very air around them had become thick with fear. Then, without warning, the creature broke through. Its hands ripped through the quilt, fingers grasping at the air, pulling itself from the fabric in jerky, unnatural movements. Its face, now fully visible, was a grotesque, misshapen version of a human, its eyes wild and desperate. The moment it was fully out of the quilt, it let out a terrifying howl that sent Rebecca stumbling back, her hands trembling. "Get back!" Adam shouted, pushing Rebecca away from the creature. His gun was in his hand before he even realized what he was doing, the cold metal steady in his grip. But it was no use. The thing before them wasn't something a bullet could stop. The creature turned its head, locking eyes with Adam. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. The eyes were empty voids, filled with nothing but hunger and torment. But there was something else too, something familiar. "Help me," it whispered. The voice was barely audible, like a breeze through the trees. But Adam recognized it immediately. It was the voice of one of the missing the widow's husband. His eyes widened in disbelief. No, it's not possible," Adam muttered to himself, his mind racing. The soul inside this creature wasn't just trapped, it was aware. The creature took another step forward, its hands clawing at the floor as it moved with unnatural speed. Its mouth opened wide, revealing jagged teeth, and it lunged at Adam with a hunger that was both primal and heartbreaking. But Evelyn's voice, calm as ever, stopped it in its tracks. "They won't stop until they're free," she said, almost sadly. "But they can't leave without a price. I've tried to contain them, Sheriff. I've tried to keep them safe. But this," she looked at the creature, her expression strained. "This is what happens when the hunger takes over." For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The creature stood still, its twisted body hunched over, its gaze locked on Adam as if it were waiting for something. Then, before anyone could react, Evelyn stepped forward, her hand raised. Enough. The creature froze, its head tilting to one side. Evelyn's eyes glowed with an unnatural light as she murmured something under her breath. The air seemed to shift, and with a sickening pop, the creature suddenly collapsed back into the quilt, its form disappearing once more into the fabric, leaving behind only a faint shimmer where it had been. Adam's heart was still racing, his mind spinning with the impossible. He didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear. Evelyn had done something far more terrible than he could ever have imagined. But what Adam didn't know was that this encounter was just the beginning. As the creatures grew stronger, so did their hunger, and now the sheriff was about to find out just how much he would have to sacrifice to stop Evelyn's terrifying creations. The events of that night left Sheriff Adam Wells with a haunting sense of helplessness. The creature, a twisted version of the man who had once been a beloved part of Ashford, was still fresh in his mind. But as disturbing as the encounter had been, the creature's return to the quilt wasn't what troubled him most. It was Evelyn's words. This is what happens when the hunger takes over. What did she mean by that? Was there a point at which the souls inside the quilts stopped simply being trapped, stopped simply watching, and became something far more dangerous? And what was worse, had they truly been watching him all along? Adam's thoughts raced as he and Rebecca left Evelyn's shop, the quiet stillness of the night pressing in around them. They had to act fast. The sheriff was sure of one thing. If they didn't stop Evelyn soon, Ashford wouldn't just lose more of its residents, it would lose everything. "Sheriff, we can't let her keep doing this," Rebecca said, her voice urgent but tired. "The longer these souls stay trapped, the more dangerous they become. We need to destroy the quilts, all of them, before it's too late." Adam nodded grimly. "But how do we destroy something that's not just fabric? How do we destroy something that holds the very souls of the dead?" Rebecca's face tightened as she thought, her mind working furiously. "I don't know, but Evelyn's craft is old. There has to be a way to undo it. We just have to figure it out before it's too late." But the more Adam thought about it, the more he realized that time was running out faster than they could handle. The town wasn't just in danger of losing more people to Evelyn's quilts, it was on the brink of being completely overtaken by the horrors inside them. The quilts were coming to life, their threads growing tighter, pulling people closer to their doom. That night, as the sheriff lay in his bed, restless and haunted by the events of the day, he felt something in the air. It wasn't just fear or dread, it was something more alive. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it all around him like a presence, watching, waiting. Suddenly, there was a knock at his door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he rose, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm, but he didn't need it. As he opened the door, he found himself face to face with someone he hadn't seen in years, someone he never thought would come back to Ashford. It was Sarah Carter, the widow of the missing man, the one who had begged him to investigate Evelyn. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hands trembling as she clutched something to her chest. "Sheriff, it's happening again," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Has come back." Adam's blood ran cold. The missing men and women of Ashford were supposed to be gone, trapped in the quilts, but Sarah's words made something shift deep inside him. He followed her outside, his mind racing. "What do you mean, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low. "What do you mean, has come back?" She glanced over her shoulder, her face pale as if she were afraid to speak too loud. "I saw him in the window, my husband, but he wasn't alive. He was..." She stopped, biting her lip. "He was inside one of Evelyn's quilts, and he was calling out to me, begging me to help him." Adam's heart pounded. This was it. The souls inside Evelyn's quilts weren't just watching, they were calling out, and the longer they stayed, the stronger they became. "Where is he?" Adam asked urgently. "Where did you see him?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her eyes filled with terror. "I saw him through the window, and I couldn't reach him in time, but I know Hes not gone. Hes still in that quilt. Hes still alive in there." Adam's mind raced. The quilts weren't just prisons anymore, they were portals. They were opening up, letting the trapped souls try to break free. The lines between the living and the dead were blurring, and Evelyn had no idea how dangerous it was getting. "I need you to show me where you saw him," Adam said firmly. "We need to stop this." The night was heavy with tension as Adam and Sarah made their way through the town. The streets were eerily silent, the air thick with the kind of anticipation that only preceded something horrifying. They reached Sarah's house, and Adam could feel the presence of something unnatural lurking in the shadows, watching them. As they approached the window Sarah had seen her husband through, Adam could barely breathe. There, on the other side, he could see a shadow moving slowly, deliberately. It was the shape of a person, but distorted, stretched out of proportion. He stepped forward, and his breath caught in his throat. There, behind the glass, he saw the unmistakable face of the missing man, one who had been sewn into the quilt. But this was different. This was not the man he had known. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with an unnatural hunger. The moment he saw Adam, the man's mouth opened wide, unnaturally widened. He let out a sound so terrifying, so inhuman, that it felt like the very air had been sucked from Adam's lungs. "Help me," the man's voice echoed from the window, but it was no longer his voice. It was warped, like the voice of something monstrous, something that had been twisted beyond recognition. Adam tried to move forward, but before he could reach the window, the figure inside began to claw at the glass, its hands moving with a speed and desperation that was unnatural. The face pressed against the window, its eyes wide and begging, and then, without warning, the glass shattered. The sheriff staggered back in shock as the figure leaped out of the broken window, its hands reaching for him. But before Adam could react, something even more horrifying happened. The figure's body began to unravel its limbs, stretching and contorting in impossible ways, until it was nothing but a mass of fabric, threads, and pieces of the quilt it had once been bound to. And then, the quilt itself began to pulse as if it were alive. The fabric shifted and writhed, twisting around Adam's legs, pulling him toward the center of the mass. "Help me!" the voice cried again this time from all around him. But as Adam realized the truth, the quilts were alive, feeding on the souls they had trapped, he knew that if he couldn't stop them now, Ashford wouldn't just be overtaken by the dead. It would become a place where the living and the dead collided in an eternal nightmare. The weight of the night's event settled heavily on Sheriff Adam Wells' shoulders as he stood in the middle of Sarah's living room, surrounded by the chaos that had spilled out of Evelyn's quilts. The figure, the distorted man who had once been Sarah's husband, is gone, but the sense of dread lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The sheriff's mind was racing, his thoughts spinning in every direction. He had just witnessed the impossible. The dead weren't just trapped in the quilts, they were fighting back. They were desperate to escape. Adam's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Sarah, whose face was pale and stricken with terror. "You saw him. He spoke to you," he murmured, trying to make sense of it all. He wasn't just a ghost. He was something else. Hez. Alive, but not alive. Sarah could only nod, her eyes wide as she clutched her arms tightly. "I don't understand it, Sheriff. I saw him. It was him, but it wasn't. His eyes were empty, and his voice, it wasn't him. It was like something was inside him." Adam ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his breath. He couldn't process everything at once. He knew one thing for certain now. Evelyn hadn't just been trapping souls in her quilts. She had changed them, twisted them into something new, something dangerous. They weren't just watching anymore. They were becoming hungry, and the longer they stayed, the more they fought to break free. "There's no time to waste," Adam said, more to himself than to Sarah. "We need to get to Evelyn. We need to stop this before it spreads any further." Sarah, still shaking, nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "But Sheriff, how? How do we stop something like this?" Adam looked around the room, trying to formulate a plan, but his mind kept returning to Evelyn. She was the key to all of this. If they could stop her, they could stop the madness. But how could they stop someone who had mastered a dark art so ancient, so twisted, that it defied the very laws of nature? It wasn't long before Adam and Sarah made their way back to Evelyn's shop, the path ahead clouded by uncertainty. The town seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with tension. The closer they got to the shop, the more Adam felt the presence of something else's something watching them. It was as if the town itself had become a trap, each step they took deeper into its grip. Evelyn's shop loomed ahead, a place that had once been a symbol of beauty and craftsmanship, but now felt like a tomb, a dark heart beating with the pulse of the souls trapped inside the quilts. Adam's skin prickled as they stepped inside. The air was colder than before, and the silence was so thick that it pressed against his eardrums. But Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. The shop was dark, the faint light from the windows casting long shadows over the quilts spread out on the tables. The place looked abandoned, but Adam knew better than to assume that. "Evelyn?" Adam called out, his voice steady but full of urgency. "We need to talk." There was no answer, but as he stepped further into the shop, his eyes were drawn to the largest quilt at the back of the room, partially covered by a sheet. His heart skipped a beat. Something about it felt wrong alive. He could feel it, like an electric charge running through the room. Without thinking, Adam moved toward it, his hand reaching out to pull the sheet away. But before he could touch it, the quilt began to move. The fabric rippled, the seams pulling tight as if something was trying to break free from within. "Stop!" Evelyn's voice rang out from the shadows, sharp and frantic. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale and strained, her eyes wild with fear. Adam instinctively stepped back, his hands still hovering over the quilt. Evelyn's gaze flicked between him and Sarah, her breath ragged. "You don't understand," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "It's too late. They're too strong now. They've been feeding, growing, and now they're unstoppable." Adam's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, unstoppable? What's going to happen?" Evelyn's face twisted with a mix of sorrow and regret. The longer the souls stay, the stronger they become. And when they're strong enough, they don't just escape, they take. Sarah gasped. "Take? Take what?" "They take everything," Evelyn whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "They take control. They take life." Before Adam could respond, the quilt in front of them suddenly convulsed. The seams split open with a terrifying rip, and the figure inside the one Adam had seen in Sarah's window emerged. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a twisted version of the missing man. It was a mass of writhing limbs, contorted faces, and half-formed bodies, each one an amalgamation of the souls trapped inside. It was as though the quilt had become a breeding ground for something darker, something far more terrifying. The creature's eyes locked onto Adam's, its voice a twisted amalgamation of the souls it contained. "Help me," it whispered, its voice barely a breath. "Help us." The thing reached out, its hand stretching toward them, its fingers elongated and jagged, like claws. Adam stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The thing wasn't just trapped, it was angry, and it was hungry. "Get back!" Adam shouted to Sarah as he drew his gun, but Evelyn stepped forward, raising her hands. "No, don't shoot!" she cried, her voice frantic. "You don't understand. If you kill any of them, you'll release them all. They'll break free and this town will be destroyed." Adam's mind raced, his instinct screaming at him to do something to stop the creature. But Evelyn's words rang in his ears. They'll break free. The last thing Adam wanted was for the horrors to spread beyond Ashford. "Then what do we do?" Adam demanded, his gun still trained on the creature. "We can't just let it go." Evelyn's face twisted in pain, as if she were being torn between two worlds. "There's a way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's dangerous. I can undo what I've done. I can set them free. But it will require a sacrifice." "A sacrifice?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with fear. "What kind of sacrifice?" Evelyn's eyes darkened. "I will have to let go of them, all of them. I have to release the souls, and in doing so, I will become part of the quilt. My soul will be trapped in the fabric, and I will never be able to leave." Adam's heart raced. "You want to die for this?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with resignation. "I never wanted this to happen, but I have to stop it." Before Adam could respond, the creature lunged toward them, its claws reaching for Evelyn. But she was already moving, her hands glowing with an eerie light as she began to chant in a language Adam couldn't understand. The quilt began to shake violently, its seams splitting open. The souls inside began to scream screams of rage, of agony, of desperation. The air thickened with their voices, their pleas for release. Adam felt the ground beneath him tremble. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp as Evelyn's chant grew louder, her power pushing back against the creature, against the souls. It was as if she was holding the world together with nothing but her will. Then, with a deafening crack, the quilt shattered. The creature, along with the souls trapped within, exploded into a blinding light, flooding the room with an intense, searing heat. But as the light faded, Adam realized with a sickening feeling that this battle wasn't over. The creature was gone, but the damage had already been done, and now something far worse was awakening. The air in Evelyn's shop felt heavy with the aftermath of what had just occurred. The room was bathed in an eerie silence, broken only by the distant hum of the wind outside. Adam stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his mind struggling to process everything he had just witnessed. The creature had exploded into light, its writhing form dissolving into nothingness, but Evelyn's spell hadn't come without a cost. The quilt had shattered, but its destruction had come with a blinding force that had nearly knocked Adam off his feet. The light had been so intense, it felt as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. And now, as the smoke began to clear, he could feel a strange sense of stillness in the air, as if something important had been set in motion. Evelyn, her face pale and drawn, stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling as if the very weight of what she had just done was crashing down on her. Her once calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker, a deep sorrow mixed with a sense of finality. "Evelyn," Adam said, his voice hoarse. "What happened? Did it work? Is it over?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the remnants of the destroyed quilt, the once vibrant fabric now a tattered mass of threads. Her eyes filled with something like regret, maybe even guilt. "It's never over," she murmured, more to herself than to Adam. "You can't undo what's been done. You can only delay it." Her gaze lifted, locking onto Adam's. "The souls are free for now, but they're not gone. They're just waiting for the next thread to be sewn." Adam's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about? They're gone, aren't they? They've escaped, they know." Evelyn cut him off, her voice sharp. "They'll never truly escape. They're like a poison now, a disease. They've become part of the fabric of this place. And I've been their keeper for far too long." The air seemed to grow colder, and for the first time, Adam noticed something unsettling. It wasn't just the remnants of the quilts or the broken, twisted remnants of the creature. The shop itself felt alive. The shadows were thicker than they should have been, and the walls seemed to press in on him as if the entire place was pulling him into its depths. The very essence of the quilts what they had represented was still here. It had been torn apart, sure, but the damage wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. And now, Evelyn was paying the price. She slowly walked over to one last quilt hanging in the corner of the room Adam hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others, almost delicate in appearance. The fabric shimmered faintly, as if it were glowing with some inner light. It looked innocent enough, but Adam could feel it. He could feel the pulse of something malevolent, something waiting inside that quilt. "That's the last one," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The final quilt." Adam felt his breath catch in his throat. "What do you mean, the final quilt?" Evelyn turned to face him, her eyes hollow. "I never wanted to make it, but it had to be done. It's the last thread, Sheriff, the one that binds everything together." Before Adam could respond, the quilt began to move. It was subtle at first, a small shift, like a slight breeze blowing across its surface, but then it began to ripple, as if something inside was trying to escape, just like the creature before. And then, as if in response to the movement, the very fabric of the room began to tremble. The shadows deepened, the air grew heavier. Adam stepped back, instinctively reaching for his gun, but Evelyn shook her head. "You can't fight this," she said, her voice filled with resignation. "You can't stop it. The quilt is the last piece, the last trap." A cold chill ran down Adam's spine. He realized with growing horror that this was not the end. This was the beginning of something far worse. The quilt's fabric began to unravel at the edges, threads pulling free, one by one, like veins slowly being torn open. The very seams of reality itself were splitting apart. Adam watched, horrified, as a figure began to emerge from the quilt, a face, twisted and distorted, just like the others. But this one was different. It was familiar. The eyes, though distorted, seemed to hold recognition. "Evelyn," Adam whispered, his voice trembling. "What have you done?" The figure slowly rose from the quilt, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on a string. It looked almost human, but the face it faced was one Adam would never forget. It was his own. Adam staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. The thing his doppelganger stared at him with empty, hollow eyes, its mouth slowly stretching into a twisted grin. "Help me," it whispered, but it wasn't his voice. It was a sickening mockery, a distorted echo of his own. Evelyn watched the unfolding horror with a look of complete helplessness. "That's the final sacrifice," she murmured. "The final piece of the puzzle. I didn't know it would be you, Sheriff, but it had to be. The last thread needed to be woven." Adam's heart raced, and he turned toward Evelyn, his voice breaking through the chaos. "What is this? What do you mean by the last thread?" "The quilt," she said, her eyes dark and empty. "It wasn't just about trapping souls anymore. It was about replacing them. The more I stitched, the more I gave. And now I've created a perfect replica, a second chance for the soul that never left." The figure in front of Adam's own twisted reflection took a step forward, its body moving in jerky, unsettling motions. "Come to me, Sheriff," it whispered, its voice full of venom. Evelyn's face twisted in pain as she glanced down at her trembling hands. "I never meant for it to end like this, but the quilt doesn't just hold memories, it holds replacements. The price is always paid." Adam's pulse quickened as the figure lunged at him, its hands reaching for his throat, its eyes filled with hunger. But before he could react, the quilt suddenly froze in place, its threads pulling tighter, forcing the creature back into the fabric. Evelyn's hand shot out, and with a final chant, the quilt exploded into light-blinding searing. Adam closed his eyes, the heat searing his skin, but when the light faded, the shop was empty. Evelyn was gone. The quilt was gone. But as Adam stood in the ruins of Evelyn's shop, something shifted. The quilt was gone, but the echo of its power remained. And the worst part? He felt something tugging at him, an undeniable pull toward the fabric of reality itself, a whispering thread he couldn't quite escape. The shop was quiet, nowherely quiet. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that had filled the room moments ago had dissipated with the final flash of light. Adam stood alone in the wreckage, his pulse still racing. Evelyn was gone. The quilt that had once held the souls of the dead, twisted and hungry, was now nothing more than a pile of ash and burned fabric. But something wasn't right. He could feel it. The air around him felt wrong, as if reality itself had been pulled taut and was about to snap. Adam took a step back, his eyes scanning the empty room. His hand trembled as it hovered over his sidearm, but there was no need for a gun anymore. Evelyn's curse had been broken, or so he thought. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, began to fill the room. It vibrated through the floorboards, and Adam's bones seemed to ache with it. He could feel the vibrations crawling up his spine, gnawing at him from the inside. The quilt, what was left of it, was still there, a pile of shredded cloth at his feet, but there was something else, something darker. Without warning, the pile of fabric began to shift. Slowly, methodically, it began to pull itself together, threads weaving back into place with an unnatural speed. Adam's heart skipped a beat as he backed away, his mind racing. He had to leave. He had to get out. But before he could move, the quilt surged to life. The air turned colder, and the threads twisted and contorted like writhing snakes, pulling themselves together faster than he could comprehend. The quilt seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, the fabric trembling as if it were alive. The seams began to close, and the threads tightened like a noose around Adam's chest. And then he heard it. The voice, deep and familiar, whispered through the fabric. "You can't run from us. Not now. Not ever." Adam froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakable, it was his own. But it wasn't him speaking. It was them souls inside the quilt, the ones who had been twisted and changed by Evelyn's magic. A figure began to form from the fabric, its outline slowly becoming clear. At first it was a blur, but as it solidified, Adam's blood ran cold. It was a perfect replica of him. His face, his body, even the way his shirt hung loosely around his shoulders. But the Aisto's eyes were different. They were empty, hollow, like the eyes of the creatures he had seen before, the ones trapped in the quilts. And worse, they were filled with a hunger, a darkness that seemed to consume everything in their path. "No," Adam whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're not me." The figure grinned, the same twisted, empty smile he had seen in the reflection earlier. It opened its mouth, but the words that came out weren't his own. "I am you, and you are me. We are the same now." The quilt continued to pulse around them, growing tighter, its fabric wrapping around Adam like a second skin. The twisted version of him stepped forward, its arms stretching unnaturally long, its fingers elongating into sharp claws that scraped against the floor. Adam's mind raced. This wasn't just another soul breaking free, it was something far worse. Evelyn's final sacrifice had replaced him. His essence, his soul, had been woven into the fabric, creating an imperfect, monstrous version of himself. And now, that version was coming to claim what it wanted. "What do you want from me?" Adam demanded, his voice steady despite the terror creeping up his spine. The creature laughed, but the sound was hollow, devoid of any warmth. "I don't want anything from you. I am you. And now that I'm free, I'll take everything." Adam's heart pounded in his chest as the figure lunged, its claws aiming straight for his throat. But in that moment, the quilt seemed to come alive with a mind of its own. The fabric twisted, pulled tight, and the figure froze in midair. It struggled against the quilt, its body writhing, but it couldn't break free. "What's happening?" Adam gasped, his hands shaking. A voice echoed through the shop, but it wasn't the creature's voice. It was Evelyn's, soft, strained, almost a whisper. "You can't escape the price, Sheriff. The quilt will always want more." The creature's doppelganger screamed in fury as the threads of the quilt tightened around it, forcing it back into the fabric. The air in the room thickened, the room shaking with a power that Adam couldn't explain. It was as if the very foundation of reality was coming undone. Evelyn's voice continued, distant but clear. "The final sacrifice was always meant to be this. When the last thread is sewn, the one who creates the quilt becomes part of it. The souls, the ones who break free, replace what's been lost. The price of freedom is never paid in full." Adam stepped back, watching as the creature was slowly pulled back into the quilt, its struggles growing weaker as the fabric closed in around it. The quilt now pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as if it were feeding on the energy of the battle between the two versions of Adam. The force was enough to make the walls of the shop tremble, and the floor beneath Adam's feet seemed to shift. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The shop fell silent, the fabric of the quilt lying still, lifeless, as though it had never moved at all. Adam's breath came in sharp gasps, his hands shaking as he surveyed the room. The figure's twisted doppelganger was gone. The quilt was quiet, its threads loose and unmoving. But Adam couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. Evelyn's warning echoed in his mind. The quilt will always want more. The room felt like a tomb, and Adam realized with a shiver that the town wasn't safe. No one was. Ashford was a place where the living and the dead collided, a place where the price of freedom could never truly be paid. But as Adam turned to leave, he felt it tug in the fabric of reality itself, pulling him back toward the shop, pulling him towards something far darker, far more dangerous. The quilt may have been destroyed, but the souls inside it weren't finished with him yet. The quiet of Ashford seemed to mock Adam as he walked down the narrow streets, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong, that whatever had been set in motion in Evelyn's shop wasn't over. No, it was just beginning. He had watched the quilt come to life, seen his own twisted reflection break free from the fabric of his soul. He had heard Evelyn's voice echoing through the air, warning him that the price of freedom was never truly paid. But what did it all mean? How could he stop something like this? Adam had thought he was done with the nightmares, that they had all been contained, but now he was no longer sure. He couldn't go back to the life he had before. The line between the living and the dead had been irrevocably blurred, and Ashford had become ground zero for a battle that was far from over. As he made his way back to the sheriff's office, Adam felt an unnatural chill creeping up his spine. He couldn't explain it, but the town felt different. The very air around him seemed heavier, suffocating. It was as if the darkness had seeped into the streets, into the very bones of Ashford, and was now spreading, pushing against the walls of reality itself. When he reached the office, the door creaked open on its own, and Adam stepped inside, his hand on the grip of his gun. His instincts were telling him something was wrong, something was waiting for him in the shadows, but there was no one there. The office was empty, just the way it had been for days now, or so it seemed. As Adam approached his desk, his eyes caught something, a piece of paper, a note, lying on the surface. It was hastily scribbled, the handwriting jagged and uneven, almost frantic. "It's not over, Sheriff. You've unleashed something worse than death. The town is just the beginning. The quilt isn't finished. Neither are you." Adam's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he turned the paper over, but there was no signature, no clue as to who had left the note. He scanned the room, his mind racing. How had someone gotten in? How had they known? Suddenly, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Adam spun around, his hand reaching for his gun. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure shrouded in darkness, a silhouette he couldn't quite make out. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking but firm. "Come out. Now." The figure didn't move, didn't respond. For a long moment, all Adam could hear was the sound of his own breath, the air thick with tension. And then, slowly, the figure stepped forward, revealing its face. Adam's blood ran cold. It was him, or at least it looked like him. The doppelganger, the twisted version of himself from the quilt, was standing right in front of him. Its eyes were dark, hollow, the same eyes that had stared at him through the fabric filled with hunger. The creature's mouth stretched into that same twisted grin, the one that had haunted Adam's thoughts for days. "No," Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, this can't be happening." The creature didn't speak at first, just watched Adam with its empty gaze. And then it finally moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. "You can't run from yourself, Sheriff," it said, its voice echoing in the room. "You've been running all this time trying to stop what you can't control. But I'm here, and it'll never leave." Adam took a step back, his mind reeling. The figure, this creature that looked so much like him, wasn't just an echo of the quilt. It was him, a part of him twisted and corrupted by the very thing he had been trying to destroy. He had thought he had stopped it, but now he understood. He hadn't freed anyone. He had released something far worse. "You're not me," Adam growled, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're just a reflection, a shadow. You can't have control over me." The creature laughed at a low, mocking sound. "Control? I don't need control. I am you. And now that I'm here, there's nothing you can do to stop me." Adam's heart raced as he looked around the room, his mind searching for a way out. But there was no escape. The shadows seemed to press in, suffocating him. The quilta thing he thought was destroyed was still alive, still pulling at him, threatening to consume everything. Evelyn's sacrifice had only made things worse. He had released a part of himself, a part that had been twisted and corrupted by the souls trapped in the quilt. And now that part was standing in front of him, in his office, ready to claim what it believed was its right. "Please," Adam pleaded, his voice desperate. "You don't have to do this. Whatever you are, we can stop this together. We can end it." The creature's grin widened, its hollow eyes narrowing. "It's too late for that, Sheriff. It's already done. You let me out, and now I'm free. And you? You're just a piece of the puzzle, a small part of the bigger picture, a part of the quilt." The word echoed in the room like a death knell. Adam staggered backward, the weight of the creature's words sinking in. The quilt hadn't just been a prison. It had been a web, a trap that was pulling him and everyone else in Ashford deeper into its grasp. Evelyn had been right. The quilt was never truly finished, and now Adam was trapped in it. The creature took another step forward, its fingers stretched out toward Adam, its claws now sharp and deadly. "You thought you could escape me. You thought you could destroy the quilt, destroy the curse, but you've only made it stronger. Now, we're all part of it, all of us." But before, the creature could reach him. The lights in the office flickered, and for a moment, Adam saw something impossible out of the corner of his eye. The quilt, still visible in the shadows, began to move once more. This time, it wasn't just the creature that was coming. It was something far worse, something that would change everything. The lights in Adam's office flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the walls. He was trapped. The creature's twisted doppelganger stood before him, its claws reaching out, its grin widening with every passing second. The quilt, still visible in the corner of the room, pulsed with an unnatural energy. Adam could feel it pulling at him, the weight of its power pressing against his chest. But just as the creature moved forward, something strange happened. The air grew thick, heavier, almost suffocating, as if reality itself was about to collapse. Adam's mind raced. He didn't know how much longer he could fight it. The creature was him, yet not him. A reflection, a broken piece of his soul released by Evelyn's curse. "You thought you could destroy it," the creature snarled, its voice dripping with malice. "You thought you could stop the inevitable. But now, you're part of the quilt. We all are." Adam's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the creature. The last thing he wanted was to be absorbed back into the quilt. But that was what this thing wanted, to claim him, to consume him entirely. His reflection had become his worst nightmare, but he couldn't afford to give in to it. "Not now. Not if I can stop you," Adam spat, his voice trembling with fear but still laced with defiance. "I will not become part of this nightmare." The creature chuckled, the sound hollow and cold. "You think you can stop me? You're already part of the pattern. It's too late for you." But just as Adam thought he was about to lose everything, just as the creature lunged toward him with outstretched claws, the entire room seemed to shift. The walls quaked and the lights flickered wildly. The quilt, now fully animated, seemed to stretch, growing in size, its edges curling upward like an open mouth, eager to devour whatever was within reach. Adam's mind screamed for answers. He had to think fast. The creature's twisted reflection was just a piece of the larger, more insidious force. He wasn't fighting just himself. He was fighting the very fabric of the curse itself. It was a web, one that had been woven through Ashford, through the town's very soul. And then, in that split second, he understood. The quilt wasn't just a place to trap souls. It was the prison and the Keith doorway between life and death, the place where the dead and living collided. The more souls Evelyn had trapped, the stronger the quilt had become. The final price of freedom was never really paid because it was never meant to be. "Evelyn," Adam whispered, a realization hitting him with the force of a hammer. She wasn't just a victim of the curse. She was part of it. The curse used her. His mind raced as the creature advanced, but this time, Adam didn't retreat. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of his own fear and desperation, but also the growing certainty that this could be stopped. Not through force, but by understanding. He had to sever the thread, the last connection that kept the quilt alive. "Evelyn tried to set you free, but she only wove you into the pattern," Adam said, his voice steady as he faced the creature. "She didn't sacrifice herself to save you. She did it to release the quilt, to destroy it from the inside." The creature snarled, its form shifting and twisting, its claws scraping against the wooden floor. "You don't understand. There is no escaping the pattern. We are all part of it. All of us." Adam's mind flashed to the missing people, the souls trapped inside the quilt. They weren't just victims. They were pieces of the puzzle, part of a never-ending cycle that had been repeated for generations. And now, Adam himself was a part of it. But there was still one last piece of the puzzle he needed to solve. One last piece that Evelyn had left behind. The quilt had been destroyed but not finished. The last thread, the last stitch, was missing. In that moment, Adam understood what he had to do. He had to destroy the last thread, the final stitch that bound him to the creature, to the quilt, to the curse. But it wasn't something he could fight or destroy physically. No, it was something deeper. It was the very essence of what the quilt represented. The creature lunged at him again, but this time Adam didn't move. Instead, he closed his eyes, his heart pounding, his breath slow and steady. He reached deep within himself, reaching for that place inside of him where the pattern the quilt was stitched into his soul. It was still there, just beneath the surface. He could feel the tug, the pull of it, like a rope binding him to a past he couldn't escape. "I am you," the creature hissed. "We are one." Adam took a deep breath and let go. He released the thread, the tie that bound him to the creature in the quilt. It wasn't about fighting the creature, it was about forgiving it, letting go of the darkness inside him that had been twisted by the curse. In that moment, he severed the connection between them. The final thread snapped. The creature froze mid-lunge, its form wavering. For a moment, Adam could see the soul inside Ithis own trapped, struggling to break free. And then, with a deafening crack, the creature collapsed, disintegrating into dust and threads, dissolving into nothingness. The quilt, too, unraveled, its final threads snapping as they were torn apart by the force of Adam's will. The shop was silent. Adam opened his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. The weight that had been pressing on him and Ashford, on everything lifted. The curse was broken, the cycle was over. But even as he stood there, trying to grasp the enormity of what he had just done, a strange lingering feeling settled over him. He looked down at his hands. They were still his, but something had changed. He wasn't the same person who had walked into Evelyn's shop all those days ago. He had become part of something much bigger than himself. And yet, even with the quilt destroyed, the lingering question remained, was he truly free? Final payoff. As Adam walked out of the shop, leaving behind the ruins of the quilt and the creature that had once been his own twisted reflection, he knew one thing for certain. Ashford had been saved for now. But as the wind whispered through the trees, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that the price of freedom had yet to be fully paid. The quilt was gone, but its presence still haunted the town, and somewhere, deep in the fabric of reality, there was a thread waiting to be sewn again.